Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you, and good evening, I suppose, to some others. Um, Hello, and welcome to the second event in the 2020 U.S. election series. My name is Walter Russell Mead. I'm a professor at Bard College, and today I'm joined by Ben Judah to discuss what a Joe Biden administration's foreign policy might look like. So if you will remember that about a week ago, we did a similar event with someone from the Trump administration, and we will continue trying to provide insight for our audience from different perspectives. Ben Judah is a journalist and contributing writer at Politico. He's traveled extensively in Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and many other publications. He's interviewed numerous public figures from French President Emmanuel Macron to First Lady of the US, Melania Trump. Judah has worked as a policy fellow for the European Council on Foreign Relations and as a research fellow for the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative. He's also worked with Vice as both a presenter and producer for short documentaries. He's the author of Fragile Empire, an examination of Vladimir Putin's Russia, and This is London, an investigation into the lives of London's immigrant populations. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to talk with you about what could be the future administration.
Right. Well, I understand you do not have an official position with the campaign, but or am I wrong about that?
I've been in contact with the campaign, and I have sort of informally and in a volunteer capacity sort of spoken with them and suggested sort of various policy areas.
Okay, so you're sort of in the zone, but not an official. You're not here as a spokesperson for the campaign.
I'm not a spokesman for the campaign. I'm not a spokesman for the campaign. Anything I say is simply my own kind of observations about.
Exactly. So I understand you were recently at it. You were a guest at a retreat with members of the campaign and people talking about it. Don't tell us anything you're not supposed to tell us, but what was your impression coming away from that about what you think the big themes of a Biden foreign policy might be?
Well, I think the best place to begin in trying to work out what a Biden foreign policy will look like is by asking ourselves, how different will it be from Barack Obama's late foreign policy? What are the big intellectual changes? What are the conceptual changes that have happened in how the Democratic Party conceptualizes foreign policy whilst it's been in opposition? And I think the key takeaway that I'd like to give you here is that the concept of foreign policy and what it is and what it includes has changed and expanded, certainly for what could be the younger cadres of the administration whilst they've been in opposition. So there has been an intellectual fusion where foreign policy is seen as fusing with industrial policy, fusing with technology policy, fusing with climate policy, fusing with financial policy. And there is a desire for these regulatory spaces to be the focus of a significant amount of time and effort of a future Biden administration.
What does that mean?
Well, what it means is that there was amongst the younger operatives in the Democratic Party during Trump's first term a sense that they had neglected the importance of corruption, international financial management, climate change, and technology and technological competition with China in the way that Obama too prosecuted foreign policy. And what that would practically mean would be that in a Biden administration, there would be a desire to push international regulatory initiatives in those areas. And these parts of public policy that had previously been seen as the domestic preserve of allies and partners, or indeed of enemies, would be increasingly seen as under the things that the United States has strategic foreign policy interests in.
Okay. Let me just say something to our audience here. If you look at the bottom line of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a Q&A function there. If you have questions that you have for our guest, you are welcome to put them in there, and I will take a look from time to time and drop those in as appropriate. We also have a chat function, and that works in pretty much the usual way. Yeah, well, Ben, you're talking about
in terms of one kind of concrete issue like corruption.
Mm-hmm.
There is a sense that corruption was neglected. It was left to the domestic side of the political ledger, both here and abroad. It wasn't conceptualized as a major theme of international relations that was a core part of how the global economy unfortunately functions, and that has been used by authoritarian regimes to consolidate at home and project influence abroad. So one kind of practical idea that kind of put forward is there's been discussion about is that there could be a global kleptocracy initiative in which allies and partners would be encouraged to sign not only a statement of principles, but to commit to certain regulatory standards with the United States to create a financial space that was safer for democracy.
Mm-hmm. There's certainly been some talk about that. What about in the realm of climate change?
Well, in terms of climate change, that is another area in which certainly the younger people in that Biden world, younger people who are potentially going into a new Biden administration, have seen that as an area that didn't receive sufficient push through the foreign policy levers of power under Obama too. So in terms of what that would actually mean, there would be an agreement, there would be a desire to quickly rejoin the Paris agreement, and then to push for a new round of agreements. This is an interesting issue, and a lot of conservative and indeed centrist critics of a potential Biden foreign policy have asked, how can you try and rally around a new global agreement on climate change whilst also having to deal with the relationship with China? China, a core leading polluter. How will the Biden administration get what it wants in terms of accords with China on climate, whilst also pushing back on elements of human rights or also competing with it? There is a sense that China has discovered the importance of climate transition and decarbonization for its own self-interest, and that this will hopefully not be a major issue of discord with Xi Jinping, because he has himself set an ambitious decarbonization objective. It's important, if you look at these maps of which countries could potentially be the most ravaged by a 3-degree temperature rise, one sees China's coastal cities very much in the front line. So that's one of the assumptions of the potential administration there, that that's not going to be too much of a danger. They've also been criticized from the left for having that assumption, important to add, not just from the right talking about, it's a sort of zero-sum game on this issue. The criticism from the left has been that climate change is so important that one should downgrade any potential sort of great power competition, or even a push for greater respect for kind of international human rights norms with China. But the view, as I have heard and as I feel it is that Xi Jinping's decisions on decarbonization mean that neither of those two are going to neither of those two is to be taken too seriously. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be honest, that doesn't sound very different from the second-term Obama policy on climate. Return to the Paris Climate Accords and work to make them stronger. Is that?
Well, this is, that's a really good question. In terms of how is it going to be different, the assumption will be much more ambitious targets, much more time and effort, desire to maybe pursue smaller groups with allies, and just sort of promote the issue and have much more ambitious objectives. Like in terms of what the objectives are likely to be for decarbonisation, so on and so forth, I think there is a dramatic step change from Obama to. And in terms of like a sense in that potential future administration of how important the issue is, I think it's gone from being viewed as a major issue to one of the major issues.
You've talked about a difference between the younger people and presumably some other group of people. So what would you say is the more, I don't know if it's going to be conservative or senior side of the Obama team? How is their view different from this younger view?
I think that it's important not to caricature it. There is a generational divide. That's how I have sort of sensed it. But it's not just a generational divide. There are very much people on juniors on one side and seniors on another. There are broadly two tendencies amongst the Biden sort of centrists, as one could put it. And it's very important to also look for these differences between centrists and not just look for differences between centrists and the left and centrists and the right. One are what has been called, and not just by me, loosely restorationists, people who think that Obama too was broadly right. We should go back to that frame. We should be pursuing those policies that we were interrupted from. And then, those in a camp who are more transformers. And their vision amongst the transformers is that what foreign policy has changed, and that foreign policy needs to be a lot more about industrial policy, technology policy, 5G, trying to build global standards, trying to build global condominiums to reinforce the US and democracy worldwide, being in some ways quite interventionist into other countries' regulatory frameworks. Those are the two sort of tendencies there. The second tendency of the sort of transformers is very influenced by a lot of the intellectual thinking that went on, certainly in the Warren campaign, and to a lesser extent also the Bernie campaign, and not to forget also the sort of Inslee campaign, which contributed a lot of the sort of thinking on climate change. So that's all part of the mix, there. In terms of, those two, those are the two kind of different attitudes I kind of sense. But what does this mean, and I'm sure you're about to ask, in terms of geopolitics? Like, what are the potential differences of opinion on the core issues in the Middle East or on Russia? And I thought maybe let's just start with the Middle East here. I do detect that there is, and this doesn't really neatly map with those two generational tendencies. This is really something amongst kind of experts in the region who have different views based on experience or attitudes. There is a division about what to do long term with the geopolitics of the region. There's a desire to rejoin the Iran Accords quickly and to try and do that fast, and to make sure that the US liberates its foreign policy from having to implement Trump's maximum pressure. But firstly, there's an uncertainty about whether how easy or how hard it will be to re-enter that accord. Iran is asking for compensation to rejoin the agreement, and people are not sure. Like, that call for compensation, is it a bluff? Is it serious? If it's particularly serious, it might be very difficult to actually re-enter the Iran accord. Then the second division is, if one does re-enter the Iran accord, how far to go in terms of trying to build new agreements in the Middle East, try and bring Saudi Arabia and Iran to the table to sort of discuss regional security issues. Some who'd like to do that, some who think that's a waste of time.
Mm-hmm. What about Israel policy? Where do you think Israel policy would go in a Biden administration?
I think Israel policy was one of the more kind of interesting and fraught aspects of this, primary season in the party. I think that that's certainly going to happen when the next primaries take place in the Democratic Party at some unknown time in the future. But I actually think that it will not we are, contrary to ideas about corruption, industrial policy, finance, climate change, where the progressive wing of the party has had a significant influence on shaping the thinking of a potential administration here. I don't think that the progressive wing or the left's wing, the left's ideas on Israel policy are going to have a major shaping of the Biden administration's view of how to deal with Israel. I think it's important, having said that, to also specify that Biden's own experience in the administration and his own experience of dealing with world leaders and dealing with the region means that he's unlikely to devote as much time to it and to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as Obama did in his presidency.
That's one of the interesting things to me, just generally, is the sort of loss of steam behind the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Seems to be a difference between the Obama second term and what would be a Biden first term, is that this, except maybe on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, just seems to have less salience generally.
I think that if a different candidate had won the nomination, I think we would be having a very different conversation. A lot of it's, again, generational, but broadly, I think a good way to think about future Biden foreign policy, if he indeed wins, would be that what's been imported from the progressive wing of the party is these regulatory, geoeconomic ideas. What has not been imported are ideas about changing the relationship with Israel, or changing the US's military posture in some fundamental way. I think that those conversations could return and be very fraught at some unknown time in the future, because I think they're bubbling below the surface. I think that there will be on Israel, Palestine, there will be, of course, like a lot of voices in the administration who are very committed to that and want a more kind of even-handed or a tougher approach to Israel, but I don't think that's going to be the dominant approach. One area where I don't actually think that the Biden administration has managed to, the future Biden administration, of course, that if that indeed is what happens, has been able to carve out a distinctive kind of world view is as regards the current geopolitics of the region regarding recognition of Israel. I don't actually see a distinctive view emerging there on what the peace accords between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and this potential movement now surrounding Sudan means, and what that would, how they would approach that if they indeed win the election, I think is an open question. And one
I spoke with
by those countries themselves in terms of what they're proposing and thinking.
No, I spoke with Ambassador Otaiba from the UAE the other day, and he said he thought that, as far as he could see, this was just a gift to the Biden administration. On the one hand, they take annexation off the table, which would have been a very divisive issue if Israel had gone ahead with plans to annex parts of the West Bank. You would have seen, I think he thinks, a real intra-party fight among Democrats into how to, obviously the United States would do something, but how much and to what degree. If that's gone, and also there's simply less tension between Israel and a large number of Arab states, why wouldn't the United States just be happy with that?
Well, I think that it's a really interesting question. I think that where I think we need kind of more answers, and I think where I think there's where we need more answers, and where I'm very curious to see how things emerge, is on this friends and enemies question, and is on the relationship with specific bilateral alliances. There is a lot of talk in the Biden blob, the Biden foreign policy world, of how important it is to do things with allies, about how important alliances are. And there's a lot of talk about making the democratic frame, important again, about the need to have a summit of democracies where democracies could pledge to support each other, maybe launching some of these geoeconomic initiatives together. But when one sort of goes through each alliance one by one, I think there are unanswered questions, and I think there's more work to be done. As I see it right now, the allies that are going to be the most pleased and who are going to be potentially benefiting the most from a lot of this interest in geoeconomics are Germany, France, and the EU itself in Brussels. But even when one talks of Britain, there are potential questions there, that there are suspicions on the British side, and we shouldn't think that simply because the Democrats are potentially returning to power means that every alliance is going to be renewed and have no issues in it. If one clocks through them, there are specific challenges that need to be resolved. What does the democratic frame mean for the relationship with India? India increasingly authoritarian in many ways. That's a potential problem there. The relationship with the Philippines, relationship with Japan, issues of competition with China, all questions there that need to be answered. Indeed, the relationship with Turkey, I could go on.
So I guess that let's sort of take these one by one. If we talk about democracies as a core framework, you inevitably center on Europe because that's where the most democracies are. But arguably, that's a place in terms of sort of broader foreign policy where, in a sense, there's less to be done, that China and Europe are pretty far apart. Okay, you have an alliance of democracies, generally speaking, who don't want much, who are pretty much status quo powers with some incremental tweaks. If you think about Asia policy, you either don't think that hard about democracy, or you don't have, or your list of allies again gets reduced to sort of Japan, Australia, and maybe one or two others. If you're going to say India is more authoritarian, there's something of a clear choice, I would think, between trying to build an Asian coalition around China issues and a democracy-focused foreign policy. Is that right?
I think that there are some. I think that that's going to be a tension going forward. I would agree with you there. I think that, hopefully with sort of talent and dedication, they'll be able to navigate it. In terms of like why Europe, I think this is an important thing to stress. Europe, just one region in the world, in many ways, an aging and geopolitically less hefty one than it was 20 years ago. Why is there going to be what I think more focus on the relationships with Paris, Brussels, and Berlin? And again, the answer comes back to geoeconomics and climate. If you want to try and build a global climate change framework, you're going to have to do it with the EU because of that combined regulatory hegemony. If you really want to try and reform the world financial system so it isn't an enabler and a conduit for corruption, you're going to have to do that with Britain and with the EU. If you want to try and really begin to change global supply chains on like critical issues such as 5G, such as medical technologies, to make sure that those don't run through authoritarian states, especially China. I think there's a sense that you're going to have to do that with the Atlantic powers. So I think that the transatlantic relationship could enjoy actually a return to the focus of US foreign policy. But the big question is, will the EU and how far will the EU want to go along with potential American competition with China? So that's a very interesting question. I think that there will be a lot more receptivity to that in the Anglo countries. And I think that we can expect a lot of this activity around Five Eyes, the security alliance with intelligence alliance, a better way of putting it, with Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, having meetings and ministerials of finance ministers, of commerce ministers, and discussing ways to sort of handle the pandemic together. I think that there's will be a lot of interesting work to be done there. So I think that's an open door.
And you know an awful lot about Russia, and have seen more of Russia than most Russians, I think, or certainly than many Russians.
Well, yes.
Uh, where do you see U.S.-Russia relations going in a Biden administration?
Uh, I think that you don't need a Russia expert on the Zoom to say that we can expect the relations there to get worse, and we can expect there's going to be a desire, if the Democrats come back to power, to push back very clearly on electoral interference, on weaponized corruption in Europe and elsewhere. There's going to be a desire to push back in intelligence competition. So I think we should expect more, what one could loosely call spy wars with Moscow. And I think that there is going to be a desire to differentiate from Trump and to fill the void that has emerged around Belarus and the protests there with US absence, and take a more kind of sharply competitive with Russia approach over for example, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, or indeed the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I think that I think there will be more friction with Russia. And just, there's been so much focus on the election and on the health of democracies and the sort of alliances between them and over the last few years. I think it's quite easy to forget that there is a ring of fire right now around Putin's Russia. Chaos in Kyrgyzstan, very unclear who's actually even in power there at the moment. War between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Turkish interventionism in the region, conflict continues in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and a situation in Belarus, which, if it reminds me of anything, it actually reminds me of the situation in the Southern Cone in the 1970s, but with Russia playing the role of the United States.
Well, what do you think the Biden administration would do something about Belarus, and if so, what?
Sanctions. We can expect more sanctions. We can expect meetings.
Frankly, isn't sanctions something you do when you want to make it look like you're doing something, but aren't really doing very much?
Depends what the sanctions are. Like, that's how I would categorize certainly a lot of the British and EU sanctions. But there are different kinds of sanctions, such as the ones imposed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine, that really hit your capacity to leverage finance internationally, or to fund your banking sector, or to trade. So
but we already have those.
I think that there will be. I think we can. Everyone is going to try and imagine the situation room of, crises are going to be emerging. There are going to be more of them, I expect, in that ring of fire around Putin's empire. One is going to have voices in the room that are keen to push back on Russia, keen for the US to demonstrate that it's back as a European player and a European power. So there will be a mixture of, yes, potentially performative sanctions. And there's a very interesting critique from the left, which has emerged in the last few years, about, have sanctions really sort of run out of ground as a way to kind of control or influence authoritarian regimes? But I think that, it will also be on the cards, like more serious sanctions, depending on how things evolve in Belarus and elsewhere.
It just doesn't, it seems to me, again, that sanctions are just going to be, which I think is often the case under the current administration, sanctions are really just a way, are performative fundamentally, and have demonstrably very little impact on Putin's behavior.
I think that conversation, I feel it on the left of the party. I wouldn't say the progressives, just on the left of the party. And I feel it in the expert community and in the academic community. I don't think that there is that sense amongst the cadres that are potentially going to be going into government if Trump loses.
So a lot of huffing and puffing and some performative sanctions on Belarus.
I think that I think that there will be visits, there will be high profile.
Oh my goodness, visits.
but this is where, sort of this brings us back really full circle, actually, with which is, certainly amongst the younger people in that Biden world, there is a sense that we have in many ways hit a bit of a brick wall in terms of our ability to influence authoritarian regimes. These techniques that were potentially more effective in the 90s or in the early 2000s aren't working. What should we do? And this is where the idea of the sort of more geoeconomics agenda comes in. These people with that mindset look at the global commons, the internet, finance, for example, two prominent ones, and think, are those spaces actually making the world safer for democracy or safer for authoritarianism? I agree with their conclusion that currently everyone looks at the global financial system and how it is set up with huge pool, unregulated spaces, countless anonymity boxes, that it's actually, in a lot of ways, making the world safer for authoritarianism and corruption than it is for democracy. And then if we look at the internet, again, a similar conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What about, let's switch to Asia for a minute here, and then we'll come back to Europe. I'm looking at the questions on our Q&A box too. In Asia, you have this sort of, are we going to see the pivot to Asia that began under Obama, it certainly continued under Trump? Are we going to still be pivoting to Asia, or do you see that changing? Because you've talked about a bit more emphasis on Europe.
I wouldn't. The emphasis on Europe is an emphasis of these trying to establish these global regulatory frameworks with allies in order to, in many ways, contain China. So if we're going to see a lot of effort from the Secretary of State to get agreements with Britain and the EU on 5G, for example, the target is trying to make the democracies more competitive faced with China. So I don't think it's actually two different things. And I think that the relationship with Europe is part of the challenge of how to deal with China, because there are a lot of people who are very skeptical in the EU about how close they should be with the US in this sort of emerging era of great power competition. So what can we expect with the relationship with China itself? I think it would be accurate to say there's a debate, that there are people who are more inclined to go for a restorationist approach to the relationship with China, try and do it more like Obama did. There'll be competition and cooperation in the mix, more cooperation than competition. There's certainly a lot of people like that. Then there are people who are, more concerned about global democracy, the threat from China, very worried about technology and global supply chains, and how the US industrial base has been undermined, and indeed some potential overlap and consensus there with a lot of thoughts in the Republican Party. That's been one of the really interesting kind of debates in Washington during the Trump administration. That second category, people who want there to be much more competition than cooperation in that frame. My expectation is that that category will win out, because a Biden administration will not be able to keep silent in a way that the Trump administration did tactically about core Chinese human rights violations that are taking place. The Trump administration kept quiet or didn't speak, it is viewed loud enough about the protests in Hong Kong, only took action relatively late about what was happening in Xinjiang. Those issues, the Democratic Party is going to be much more sensitive to. I think that the challenge for a potential Biden administration in Asia is actually quite similar to the challenge that the Trump administration faces, because if you want to build, these groupings to try and be able to sort of be more resilient faced with China's rise, it's going to be tough because a lot of Southeast Asian states have very much made their peace with China and are going to be very reluctant to be to feel they're being pulled into a new Cold War.
Well, it's probably going to be the Quad plus Vietnam would be the key. The Quad is Japan, Australia, India, US.
Well, so one area, yes, I think the initiatives that I'm interested in Asian geopolitics are the Quad. I think it's a really interesting format. I'm very interested in the supply chains initiative being launched by Australia, India, and Japan. I think that's very interesting. I think that there is potentially something that can emerge out of the countries that have decided to remove Huawei in whole or in part from their 5G networks or their planned 5G networks. I think those are all areas where the Biden administration can work. But if one wants to think of these, look at the swing states, for example, as Indonesia, it's undeniable that the US has a challenge. It has to explain why and make a persuasive case why these countries are advantaged by bandwagoning a bit more with Washington faced with Beijing.
Okay. Let's swing back to Europe. Let's pivot back to Europe here. And one thing you talk about, sort of building this new finance, more regulated anti-kleptocracy finance. A name that doesn't spring to mind when I think of anti-corruption is Deutsche Bank. And and certainly if one really looks under the hood, I mean, in the French government, there's a lot of talk about regulation, but in sort of French corporate and banking practice, there's pretty consistently some other things going on that are quite interesting and mysterious. Do you think that if the US does press for a more sort of rigorous kind of anti-kleptocracy, anti-bank secrecy, tougher imposition of anti-corruption on corporate activity, that this would actually bring us closer to the Europeans, or do you see trouble along those lines?
Just to kind of broadly, very, very broad brush kind of caricature here, which is the US is pretty good on enforcement. It's pretty bad on having the anti-money laundering rules. The Europeans are very good at having the rules, pretty bad on the enforcement. What are the Europeans worried about typically looking at the US? The Europeans are worried about US enforcement on anti-money laundering being used as an unofficial and underhand commercial policy to harm their banks and to advantage US banks. The attraction of trying to get democratic allies to have common standards on finance is that it would balance those asymmetries. The US might take on a lot of, match the European rules, and the US would encourage the Europeans to match the enforcement. And through both of them,
very bad trade. We accept their rules and we urge them to enforce the rules that they're not enforcing very well now. It's hard to
one area,
a lot of support for that.
Well, one area, if one looks at the kind of often complicated and opaque world of anti-money laundering policy, one of the problems with the European ability to enforce their rules, it comes back to these problems with the euro. There isn't a single financial architecture in a lot of ways tying Europe together. There wasn't a single European anti-money laundering agency there, which meant that you had common rules, but Estonia enforcing its own anti-money laundering policies, which meant that the weakest link was the strongest link in terms of defenses. It meant that if you were a Russian kleptocrat, you could send your money through Danske Bank in Estonia. Estonia didn't have the capacity to enforce its rules, and then the money is within the Western system. So one area where I think the US can play a really, really important role is the Europeans want to set up this common EU anti-money laundering agency. It's been proposed by France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, the core states, but it's being held up by smaller countries who are consumers of US security. chiefly Estonia and the Czech Republic. So one thing that the Biden administration could do that would be very appreciated would be to kind of lean on those smaller countries and say, in our redefined and broader understanding of security and the Russian threat, you are not helping here, and we expect you to help us. I think that there is amongst European elites, I think in the last few years, the experience of the Trump administration has made them a lot more aware of the dangers of corruption and kleptocracy and the need to change. Germany, Britain, France, each in their own way have faced shocking scandals, and the governments are trying to reform after them. Germany, very recently, it's the Wirecard scandal, an incredible scandal which I urge you to kind of read about in the FT, the stuff of Netflix multi-series. So I think that the US is pushing on an open door in terms of common anti-kleptocracy standards.
What about authoritarian governments or semi-authoritarian governments within the EU? Do you see the US playing a role there, say, with Hungary or some other countries?
So this is it's a very interesting question, and this is potentially an area where there could be tensions. There is a desire, as I said, amongst many people, I think probably the dominant sense within that Biden world of foreign policy, that the democratic norms, the democratic frame, strengthening democracy, and electoral security all need to be big parts of what America is standing for in the world and pushing for. That will lead to, could lead to some European countries like Hungary being singled out. And I think that's going to be potentially very interesting. So one thing to look out for would be, and when we'll really get a sense of how serious they are about this, is who gets to be invited to the Summit of Democracies. It's a big flagship event that Biden has committed to hosting. The vision is that it should be hosted in the US, potentially in a year. So hopefully by then the pandemic will allow this not to be a Zoom call, but a sort of wonderful jamboree in Washington or Philadelphia. And the guest list, I think it's going to be very interesting to see who's on the guest list. Like, what is the qualifier for democracy?
The last time that Washington really tried to do something about an alliance of democracies was back in the Clinton administration, when there actually was a sort of democratic summit in Warsaw that Madeleine Albright pushed. And the French basically torpedoed it, prevented it from doing anything, fundamentally because they saw it as a kind of a runaround of existing institutions where the French had a lot of stakes and equities, and that this new format would not work as well for them. Do you think the democracies will that there's actually a significant agenda for an alliance of democracies, and what would that look like?
Well, I have heard frustrations and concerns about this idea from French diplomats recently.
I'm shocked.
Typically doesn't like to impose these ideological frames on its foreign policy. There is interest in this idea on wings of the German political system. There's interest in it in Eastern Europe because it's viewed as another way to defend yourself against Russia. Indeed, in earlier formats of the Alliance of Democracies or Leagues of Democracies, they were sort of had a summit, and there is actually still an office of the Bush-era League of Democracies, I believe, in Warsaw. There's interest and enthusiasm there. I think the devil is not quite in the details, but in terms of, who do we consider a democracy? Is Erdogan a Democrat? Actually, kind of complicated question, and then what does not inviting him to the Summit of Democracies do? And I think then, is Modi really a Democrat? What does inviting him? So these are all, these are challenges, I think. The democratic frame has challenges. Who's interested in this idea? Britain is interested in this idea. Australia is interested in this idea. And Japan is to a certain extent, because they're interested in action groups that they can new kind of slightly informal action groups that can take action on 5G, AI, supply chains, all of these the kind of new definition of foreign policy that I was talking about earlier. So one idea which there has been interest in and could potentially take off is the idea for a D10, which is the G7 plus India, South Korea, and Japan, that could potentially tackle some of these more technological sides of
Japan's in the G7, so there must be
Sorry,
somebody.
South Korea is my mistake.
Okay, South Korea, India, and who?
And Australia.
Okay.
Sorry, a little momentary lapse
Right.
there.
So
Now,
again, from a French point of view, a dilution of France's position.
From the French point of view, a lot of these ideas, yeah, are there are concerns about them. In terms of like French foreign policy and where it is right now, France. If you speak to French officials, their favorite catchphrase is a sovereign Europe, a Europe that's strong enough and able to take decisions and defend its autonomy, that's got regulatory and foreign policy autonomy from the United States and China. That's their kind of vision. And they are concerned that should Biden win, that there will be a desire amongst smaller European states to return to normal and just look to the US for what the lead is on foreign policy, and it will dilute their efforts to try and build that sovereign Europe. The other thing they're very concerned about right now is Turkey. Huge alarm from French officials about the southern flank of Europe, and just in recent conversations with French officials over the last 2 weeks, really strong language being used to describe Tayyip Erdogan.
Yep. Do you think the U.S. is likely to side against Turkey? Also, that under a Biden administration, also that's an interesting question in terms of in the Caucasus, we're seeing to some degree a contest between Turkey and Russia.
Yes, so I think I'm really glad that you mentioned Turkey, not only because I'm actually currently writing a profile of Erdogan, so I've been working quite closely on it, and it's been on my mind.
Have you met with him?
Well, I've only just started, but I have actually applied to meet with him. We shall see if he's available. But I think Turkey's a really challenging case, and I think Turkey is one of these places where the rubber meets the road in terms of we can have these reconceptualizations of what foreign policy is in Washington. We can desire to push things like a more democratic frame on how we relate to the rest of the world, but Turkey is a significant challenge. Like it's very hard to actually the relationship with Turkey is not one that sort of allows itself to be easily categorized like that. The US needs Turkey for what's happening in Syria and Iraq. The US has interests in encouraging Turkey to sort of compete with Russia and not be, not fall into a kind of greater alignment with Russia. But Turkey at the same time is behaving very aggressively towards Greece, towards Cyprus, staking claims to greater mineral resources in the Aegean, and Turkish interventionism has been increasing across the region in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, now in Azerbaijan. So this is a really tough challenge for for any potential Biden administration.
You have a sense, the Armenia question is going to be very interesting because Armenia has a lot of sympathy in the Democratic Party. And I think Nancy Pelosi historically has been a strong backer of Armenia. There's a big Armenian diaspora in the US. And on the other hand, if you look at it currently, Armenia is kind of allied with Russia and Iran, while Azerbaijan is allied with Turkey. Where does a Biden administration come out in all of this?
Well, this is I'm glad you picked that other example as well, because I think that that's a further illustration, along with Turkey, that when crises emerge in the Situation Room, that these frames and concepts will only get you so far, and that foreign policy will be dictated by, what it has always been dictated by personal relationships, by
Events, dear boy, events.
indeed events, and by these competing claims on what should be a US priority. In terms of Armenia, and I was lucky actually to interview the Armenian president last week. Armenia's current foreign policy play is France. It's trying to encourage France to continue to view itself as this defender of Europe, potentially even of Christendom, against Turkey. And the Armenian president was full of flattery towards Emmanuel Macron and full of criticism towards Angela Merkel for not realizing the danger posed by Ankara. When I asked him what his message was to the United States, he said that there was barely a point sort of going into it, because the US was so focused on its current domestic politics right now.
Although I do see the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan should be meeting with Pompeo in the next few days. At least that was the headline I saw this morning. So who knows what's going to come of that, if anything.
Well, I'm hoping to speak to the Azeri foreign minister when he comes to Washington on Friday. I think it's a really interesting case of looking at what foreign policy, the situation that the Biden administration could soon be dealing with in foreign policy here, because we have so many kind of components, both new and old. We have number one, in many ways, the failure of Putin's foreign policy. Putin's, when I was covering Putin's return to the Kremlin in 2012, he had visions of consolidating a Eurasian space around, sort of trade and customs, like borrowing techniques from the European Union. And actually, if we just survey the territory around Russia, as I said earlier, it's a ring of fire. Yep. Russia may have had successes in reasserting its influence in Syria, a major success for Russian foreign policy, in Libya to a certain extent, and the Russian presence has sort of increased in Africa somewhat, and in its ability to kind of sow division in the US. But in terms of achieving Putin's objective of creating a sort of softer version of Soviet hegemony in the region, it looks like a failure. So that's one of the things we see very clearly emerging in Azerbaijan and Armenia's war. And it shows the trouble that Putin has in dealing with Erdogan, and how Putin has not managed to clip and contain and keep Turkey out of what it views as its historic sphere of influence.
Yep. We had a question here, somebody asking what other issues we talked about how the Israeli-Palestinian thing seems to have lost a bit of steam in politics since Obama's last term. Are there any other issues that were very current in the Obama era that now in the intervening 4 years seem to be less of an issue and would get less attention from the Biden administration?
I think Afghanistan and Pakistan would be two very important ones.
Do you think he will get out of Afghanistan? What do you think he'll do?
I think he will continue the process of leaving Afghanistan, but I think he'll be more susceptible to encouragements to stay or leave on kind of shadow.
Okay, so if Trump doesn't get the troops out before January 20th, they're likely to stay.
I think there's a possibility that there could be some that stay, yes, but I'm not sure. But I think that there could be a possibility there. I think just in terms of what U.S. foreign policy is likely to be focused on in the next 10 years compared to the last 20 years, Pakistan, such a major focus of US foreign policy after 9/11. Afghanistan, obviously, I think those issues will definitely receive much less attention.
In a funny way, it seems that China is better at keeping Pakistan under control than the U.S. It's amazing to see how China can carry out, what some are calling a cultural genocide of the Muslim Uyghurs, and Pakistan is absolutely silent. While they used to go in hysterics about anything the U.S. did that they saw as negative toward Muslims. So, in some ways, the big U.S. issue has been, I think, the Pakistani nuclear program. And there may be a sense that China's ability to control what Pakistan does and China's interest in a rational world are sufficient that maybe the U.S. has less of an interest along the line in Pakistan. Do you think that's a
I had the chance to travel to Pakistan and spend about a month there in 2017, and I spent a bit of time on the road with the now Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, or Imran Khan, as he would pronounce it. And there is tension in Pakistan about where this relationship with China is going. You are very quickly told by officials and even by him that they are worried that they could find themselves in some semi or neo-colonial situation faced with Beijing. And there's concern that a lot of these different tentacles of the Belt and Road project could have shades of the East India Company about them. And there are elements in the Pakistani, what's called the Pakistani establishment, or the Pakistani sort of security world.
Military, yes.
Yes, but not just the military, also the spies, and there's concern about that. And I was struck both by the presence of China. You see Chinese characters everywhere. You really feel there that Belt and Road isn't an infrastructure project. That's the wrong way of looking at it. It is an attempt to build a world order with Chinese characteristics, but at the same time by mounting angst about this. And this is in terms of this is we're just at the beginning, really, in year terms of Xi Jinping and sort of China's attempts to really sort of transform Pakistani industry around its interests. So I think that what's bubbling under the surface there will come to a head. Indeed, it wasn't that long ago that a journey to Pakistan would have one would have been struck by the presence of the United States and bubbling anti-Americanism beneath the surface.
Yeah, this may be better for the U.S. in some ways. Although I do see that Pakistan is now allowing China to do some economic development on two islands in the, off the coast, which have implications for the Middle East. Very interesting.
Indeed, I think that this is just to sort of bring back full circle again. It's one of the things that there is an awareness of in the Biden world of foreign policy is that China is trying to build the world order around it, that the Belt and Road vision is not just about railways or paving roads in Somalia. It's about bringing all these governments into a relationship and a constellation around Beijing, and that these frames that I've talked about, the geo-economic frame, the democratic frame, are both in their own way attempts to answer that. The geo-economic one is beginning to think through how can we get supply chains, technology initiatives that allow the democracies to be competitive with that. And the democratic frame is, in the Summit of Democracies itself, is an attempt to kind of reassert or buttress a vision of a free world that international relations is ordered around.
Well, great. This has been a fascinating conversation, and thanks to those who sent in questions. I hope we were able to get to them, and to our guest, who sounds like he's got some very interesting journalism projects coming up.
Well, I'd like to talk to you actually about this, my Erdogan journalism project after this.
We'll have a conversation about that later. In any case, to everybody with us, thank you. We will be having some more of these events. And I understand that after the election, we're going to have Matt Taibbi here to look at the election and think about prospects for a Biden administration. Bard grad Matt Taibbi. So that will be interesting in November. Thanks to all.